Hello and welcome back. Today we're talking about Manuel Velasquez's article, Why Corporations Are Not Morally Responsible for Anything They Do. So this is a response to French. Um, he's got the opposing thesis, right, which is that a corporation is not the kind of thing that can be morally responsible. Now, he's not saying that therefore, no one should be punished if there's an oil spill or no one is morally responsible, but his idea is that the corporation as an entity, apart from the people that make it up, is not the sort of thing that can be morally responsible for an action, or even, we'll see, kind of thing that can act. So Velasquez starts out with three senses of responsible. So obviously we're going to be interested in moral responsibility. So he wants to distinguish this from some other senses of responsibility that we have in the English language. Uh, so sometimes we might say that someone is a responsible person, just meaning, oh, they're reliable, they'd be a good person to hire, you can trust them. Um, Other times we might say someone is responsible for just completing some task, right? So in my family, I am responsible for walking the dogs at night, right? Again, that's not the sense of moral responsibility. Uh, to be morally responsible means it's something that has happened in the past that you are to blame or praise for, right? So Nate is responsible for the car accident. Nate is responsible for breaking his promise. These are senses of moral responsibility, not just that you're a person that can do a certain job. But even this third sense, so moral responsibility, he notes, is sort of backwards looking, right? It says there's something in the past that happened and you're on the hook for it. You're the one to blame or to praise. Um, but even this, so we've focused in on this sense of responsible, but there still needs more clarification, right? So Velasquez says, look, sometimes X is responsible for Y just means X caused Y. So if the storm is responsible for the power outage, yeah, that's the backwards looking sense, right? It is a causal relationship, but there's no moral uh, valence there, right? It's not that the storm is to blame in some moral sense where we would need to punish or reprimand the storm, right? The storm's just not the sort of thing. So, uh, you know, the types of things that can enter into causal relations and thus be responsible in that sense is a larger class than the set of things that can cause things and also be morally responsible for those things, right? Sometimes when we say X is responsible for Y, it just means X must pay for Y. So, uh, right, if you go in a hotel and it says owners are responsible for any damage caused by pets, that just means that the owners have to pay for the damage the pets cause, but it doesn't mean necessarily that the owners are morally responsible. Likewise, my insurance company, if I have liability insurance and I cause some harm to someone, the insurance company would have to pay for it, so they'd be responsible for the damages, but they're not morally responsible. Notice that in this sense of responsible, X doesn't even have to have caused Y to be responsible, right? I didn't cause the dog to pee on the carpet. The insurance company didn't cause me to harm the person, didn't cause the harm to the person. Nonetheless, you can be responsible in the sense of having to pay for the thing. So what we really mean when we're talking about moral responsibility is X intentionally brought about Y, right? This incorporates some aspects of the first two versions, right? It does involve a causal relationship, um, but it also adds an extra layer, right? Which is the intentional part. And we talked about intentionality and intentionality with an S in the French lecture. So to be morally responsible for something, you have to cause the thing or bring it about in some way, but also you have to have done that on purpose, right? So when we say Hitler is responsible for the death of millions of Jews, here we are talking about uh, moral responsibility, right? It wasn't an accident. Uh, Notice, right? This distinguishes moral responsibility from strictly legal liability, right? Just the responsibility to pay for a thing, um, and legal liability can be transferred. I can transfer my legal liability to an insurance company. They often buy uh, further insurance. So all the insurance companies have insurance, right? So someone else ends up having to pay for my uh, fault. Moral responsibility can't be transferred in this way, right? Um, so moral responsibility, we cause something, we intend to cause it, or we bring it about, we intend to bring it about, and it's something that applies to the person or thing that, however broad, it's an open question whether it's only human persons, right, that can intentionally bring something about, or if it's broader. Um, but that responsibility can't be transferred. It attaches to the being that brought it about. So this is moral responsibility, right? This is the version we're talking about. Um, there is a similarity to criminal responsibility, right? Um, so again, if we're going to prosecute someone for a crime, uh, in order for that conviction, that trial to be, correct and just, um, that person must have brought about a wrongful act and also intended to do that, right? So if somebody, you know, holds a gun to your head and says, "Hey, you have to break your promise to your friend," right? Or you need to kick that puppy. Um, if you do the thing, uh, you're not morally responsible for it, right? You were forced to do something wrong against your will, and you're therefore not responsible. Also, uh, the difference between moral responsibility and legal responsibility is that moral responsibility does require that you knew the thing was wrong when you did it, right? Um, so uh, for example, I'm from another culture, right? And in my culture, when you meet someone, even kind of a stranger, maybe you kiss them on both cheeks, right? But maybe I'm in another culture where that is a violation. You need to you and in this culture, you need someone's consent before you kiss them on their cheeks, right? So I don't know, and I walked up to you and I do my typical cultural greeting, and I kiss you on both cheeks. Um, and in the culture I'm in, right, that's a form of assault, right? Maybe relatively weak one, but nonetheless, um, in that situation, right, you wouldn't morally blame that person because they just didn't know your culture. They didn't know that it was wrong to kiss someone on the cheek without asking them, right? So that'd be a situation where um, moral responsibility, even though the person caused some kind of harm, right? The person that got kissed may have felt, violated in some sense. Um, we wouldn't assign, I think, moral responsibility to that person from the other culture. They didn't realize, they didn't know that the thing was wrong. Now, in a legal sense, ignorance of the law is not an excuse. So in the moral sense, it is. Ignorance can sometimes excuse otherwise immoral actions. But in a legal sense, you can't do that just on a practical level because every criminal would claim ignorance of the law and then everyone would get off. So, uh, in a legal sense, it's your obligation to know what the laws are, right? In a moral sense, sometimes we might say, oh, he couldn't have known the specific cultural, moral codes that we had um, in our country or whatever. Okay, so we said for someone to be morally responsible for something, they have to bring about some wrong, and they also have to have intended to do it, right? They have to have known that it was wrong. They have to have done it anyways on purpose. So it can't be an accident and it can't be out of ignorance. So an essential part of moral responsibility is intention, right? And the action needs to be caused by the intention, right? And this sort of now we have a little detour into philosophy of action, right? So in what is an action, right? What is it to act? Um, if I hit you on the knee, like a reflex, right? If your leg moves when when a particular nerve is hit, that's not an action, right? Because you didn't intend for your leg to move, right? Um, Likewise, if somebody scares you and you jump, right, or you shudder, or you're shivering when you're cold, those aren't actions, even though they're bodily movements, because you're not intending to do it. They're sort of reflexes, right? So it's only count as an action, it has to be intended. So, if I believe that there's pizza in the fridge, I have a desire for pizza, and I form an intention to go to the fridge and get the pizza, uh, then my body stands up and walks to the fridge. That is an action, right? It flows from an intention. Now, you know, intentions can sometimes be subconscious. Not everyone is perfectly explicit in that way. Um, but if it's the sort of thing you might endorse after the fact and say, oh, yeah, I guess I jumped out of the way of that car because, my intention was to not be killed, even if it happened so fast that you weren't like consciously saying, ah, I should jump out of the way. So intentions can happen very quickly, they can happen unconsciously, but they're the sort of thing you would endorse and say, that was me, right? So any gap there where there's an action, but your intention didn't cause it, um, then we would say the agent is not acting in a strict sense. They're not in control of their body, and therefore they're not responsible for the action. Um, Now, interestingly, so this is when we have action but without intention. What if we have intention without action? For example, attempted murder, right? Um, if you intend to kill somebody, but right, you're sitting outside their home with a rifle and a scope or whatever, um, but they never show up and you never shoot them, but nonetheless the police catch you, right, sitting there. You will be arrested, right? You have done something wrong in a sense. Um, but it's not, or you even fire the shot, but you miss the person, right? So there is no murder. So there's an intention to murder, but no murder happens. Still, we can arrest you, right? Uh, so that's an interesting question. But at least what Velasquez is talking about is the reverse, right? When there is action without intention, there is no responsibility, right? But he might allow that there can be intention without action or with the wrong action and still be responsibility. So, when someone is morally responsible for a wrong in that sense, right? When they intentionally bring about an action that, causes harm to someone, we say they are blameworthy. And when they're not morally responsible for some wrong, they are not blameworthy, right? So if a bad thing happens, um, but you didn't intend it, right? uh, then you are not blameworthy, right, for that action. So, suppose you're riding your bike along a bridge and you're kind of teetering, and I think, oh no, you're going to fall off, right? So I grab your arm. Turns out you weren't going to fall off, and it turns out in grabbing your arm, I sort of twist it and I harm you. I didn't intend to harm you, right? I intended to save your life, and so typically we would say I'm not blameworthy for that harm. Right? So why are blame and punishment connected with morality, right? Why do we uh, blame or try to punish people who have intentionally harmed someone? Well, there are many reasons, and even if you have completely different accounts of the nature of right and wrong, you still end up with this idea that you should blame people for being morally responsible. If you're a utilitarian, of course, all of your reasons will be forward looking, right? Because again, the goal of the utilitarian is to maximize pleasure uh, in the future, right? You can't maximize pleasure in the past. The past is already gone. So when we punish somebody, it's not really a backwards looking thing. It's not because they did a bad thing and so we want to hurt them for that past thing. Um, you're just creating more pain, right? You can't change the past. But utilitarians do blame and punish, or they still believe that blame and punishment are useful because of the notion of deterrence, right? So if someone causes a harm, the idea is, well, if we imprison them or fine them or in some way blame or punish them, it will prevent them from doing the same sort of thing in the future, and that will minimize pain. Right? Um, Deontologists like Kant, right, uh, are backwards looking about punishment. They do think that you deserve to be punished because of the things you did in the past, not because of whatever good things we could create in the future. Um, in violating the categorical imperative, which you may recall from uh, the notion in Kant, right, which is the idea that the moral thing to do is the thing that you can universalize, right? If I can coherently say, everyone should follow the rule that help people when you can, or everyone should follow the rule that you shouldn't kill innocent people. If that's coherent, right, to make that law universal, then that is a moral law, right? Um, so violating such a law is uh, placing yourself outside of that sort of implicit rational contract that everyone in humanity, every rational being has arrived at. And in a sense, you're saying, uh, I don't want to. follow I don't want to universalize these rules, right? I want to harm other people. Oh, then in that case, I guess you want everyone else to be harmed. Or it's not that you don't universalize. I think I misspoke. I think the idea is that you are trying implicitly, if you violate the law and you kill somebody, you're sort of saying, as a rational being, oh yeah, I want everyone to murder, right? In which case, I guess we can murder you. It seems to be sort of what Kant is up to. But at any rate, yeah, punishment and blame attached to moral responsibility in really any ethical system that you can think of. So again, the point of this is about business, right? Or businesses or corporations morally responsible. French argues that they are, right? They can form intentions and they can act, and therefore they can be morally responsible, right? They can intentionally cause a harm. Velasquez is going to argue that French is wrong about this. So the question of whether corporations can be morally responsible for Velasquez is going to boil down to whether corporations can act, right? Can they bring about consequences for intentions? Can they form intentions and then act on those intentions? Um, Velasquez is going to say there's two popular interpretations of the metaphysical status of a corporation, like what sort of thing is a corporation? And the Velasquez is going to say on either interpretation, they're not the sort of thing that can perform an action. Right? So one of these interpretations is that corporations are legal fictions. We visited this in the French lecture. Um, they are not real things. They are fictional entities, right, that are created legally, but they don't walk and talk and breathe. And so they don't correspond to any metaphysical person, right? For the purposes of the law, we make up a corporation called Exxon. Um, and, it's real enough in a legal sense, but not in a there's not any real thing in the world that is Exxon. So if that's our interpretation of what a corporation is, well, then corporations can't perform actions because fictional entities can't act, right? Snow White can't pop out of the screen and punch you, do something, uh, harm you morally. Um, maybe a film could harm you psychologically, but even then, you'd want to punish the writer or the filmmaker. Again, the fictional entity Snow White isn't responsible for any of that. Um, so, if corporations are legal fictions, then any talk about responsibility has to be, says Velasquez, purely metaphorical. Right? These are not things that can act and therefore can't be morally responsible for anything. We must be, if we talk about responsibility, we're just talking about the humans associated with the entity, right? So again, if corporations are legal fictions and we say, oh, Exxon is responsible for the oil spill, we're just speaking figuratively. What we really mean is, maybe the CEO of Exxon or something like that. But that's not the only interpretation of what corporation is. Um, Another interpretation is a corporation is a real thing in the world. It's not a fiction. It's an organization. Organizations exist. What organizations are groups of people, right? And certainly people exist. Certainly people, cooperate and do things together. And if on that interpretation, a corporation is just a bunch of people. So you might think, okay, well, then corporations are real things, then maybe they can act, right? So, for example, um, I can act, and um, my body is made up of different parts, just like a corporation is made up of different parts, each of which are people. So, um, doesn't that metaphor hold, right? Can't if I can act, then a corporation should be able to act. All sorts of things have parts. Well, Velasquez pushes back on that. He says, no, your body's parts don't on their own form intentions, right? My arm doesn't form an intention. Um, it's the whole human unit, right? My brain, my mind, my body forms an intention, and then I act on it. So just because a corporation is made up of various parts doesn't make it like a human entity in terms of moral responsibility. Um, he argues that any action the corporation undertakes um, has to be the action of a person, right? The corporation itself is not acting. So we generally accept that you can't blame someone else for something someone else did, right? So one of these dogs tore up this pillow, but it would be wrong to blame We don't know which one did it, right? But it would be wrong to blame them both or punish them both. Um, so, likewise, each of the corporation's actions should be attributed to the human person that did it, right? You can't blame a corporation, argues Velasquez, for something that its members did, right? Um, corporation is made up of the members, um, but any blame has to apply to an individual member, maybe more than one member, um, but probably not all of them. Right? So let's pause to consider a potential objection here, right? Um, French's point, it seemed, was that some corporate acts can't be reduced to the actions of individual members, right? So, for example, if two corporations merge, there's no sense in which any individual member merged, right? People don't merge, right, in the way corporations do. That would be really weird. Um, but that's okay. Uh, I can be morally responsible for things I bring about, even if they can't be sort of predicated of me, right? So predicate means like an adjective sort of if I I have an object and there's something about it that I say about it, like the chair is green, or Nate is a professor, or each of you is a student. I'm predicating, right, something of you. I'm saying something about you. Um, so I can be responsible uh, for things that can't be predicated of me, right? So suppose I chop down a tree and it falls. Well, it's the tree that fell. I didn't fall. Nonetheless, I'm responsible for the falling, right? So the fact that, yeah, there are things that we would say about corporations that we wouldn't say about their members, that in some sense, at least in our language, the corporation is distinct from the members. Uh, that doesn't mean, Velasquez would argue, that the members aren't responsible for the things that the corporation does, right? So Velasquez is saying French is confusing predication with responsibility here. Again, just because a corporation can merge and humans can't merge doesn't mean that humans can't be responsible for the merging.
Sorry, change of location. Ran out of time, had to go teach a class. Um, but so picking up again, uh, so you'll recall French uh, attributes intentions to corporations that are distinct and not necessarily reducible to those of its members, right? Given the CID structure, the various actions of members, you know, whose intentions may be very different from that of the corporation, can add up to a corporate intention to, join a cartel or whatever. One member may vote for or against it. It might even vote for it, but not really intend or hope or want that the corporation end up joining it. Um, right? They may have all kinds of various intentions. They want to look like they're voting for it, but in fact are hoping that it'll fail, or so on. So, according to French, the corporation's intentions are the result of the structure. They're not reducible to the intentions of any member or group of members. So here is where Velasquez um, and French really butt heads, and I think, in a sense, this is the core of their disagreement. Um, so French says, yeah, CID strategy is the sort of thing that can have intentions, and Velasquez says, well, no, a CID strategy can't have intentions because it's not a mind, right? Um, Human minds are the sorts of things that have intentions, maybe some animal minds, and minds are the sorts of things that have feelings, emotions, dreams. Um, so corporation can't have those sorts of things, so it can't have intentions, right? Um, but that moves a little too fast. There is now I'm doing a little sidetrack in a philosophy of mind, but I think it's relevant. Um, Functionalism is a very prominent theory of mind that says um, minds are whatever does the things that minds do, right? So, for example, mousetraps are functional kinds. So you can build a mousetrap out of all sorts of things. You can have one that shocks the mouse. You can have one that's made of glue. You can have one that, a traditional snap trap. They're all mouse traps because they all do the same job, which is to catch a mouse, right? Functionalism says minds are functional kinds too, right? Um, Whatever does the job that a mind does, it's a mind, right? So, one of the things that minds do is make decisions, right? And pursue actions. And if a corporation can do that, then a corporation is a mind. It doesn't matter if it can dream, um, or have emotions, right? It's in that sense, a decision-making entity. So sure, it's as mental as anything else, and it's the sort of thing that can have intentions. So Velasquez thinks is, I guess, implicitly denying functionalism and saying for something to count as the sort of thing that can have intentions, it really needs to be more like a human mind. So, whether or not you're convinced by Velasquez or by French at this point, Velasquez has another, so he's been sort of like trying to refute French at this point, but he has his own argument um, that's a positive argument for why corporations can't be morally responsible agents. Um, and it starts with the premise or that familiar relationship between moral responsibility and blame and punishment, right? So we tend to think that we can only justly blame or punish someone if they are morally responsible for an action. So, if a baby throws up on your shirt and ruins it, you're not going to punish the baby, right? The baby just isn't the sort of thing that can be morally responsible. They're not, they don't have whatever it takes. In that case, probably a certain level of intelligence, right? Um, Likewise, you wouldn't blame someone for bumping into you if they didn't intend to. If it's an accident, you can't really sort of get morally outraged at it. Right? Now you might blame them for not paying attention, right? If they're staring at their phone or something, but that's something different than the bumping. Right? So the idea is blame and moral responsibility seem to go together. So before he gets into his argument that you can't blame a corporation, um, he wants to clarify what he means by corporation. And again, he identifies three distinct possibilities. It could be a legal fiction, right? We discussed this. It could just be a set of relationships among humans in an organization, or it could be the set of humans themselves constitute the organization. Right? Again, since fictional entities can't act in the real world, says, well, that can't be what we mean by corporation here. Fictions can't be moral agents, right? They can't act. Fiction, any more than Darth Vader could hit you with a lightsaber. He only does that in the movies, right? So the second option that we haven't quite explored yet is that maybe a corporation is not human beings exactly, but the relationships among the human beings. And this is kind of similar to what French is suggesting with his CID structure, right? And the question is, can a set of relationships be a moral agent, right? Well, Velasquez thinks no, because it doesn't make sense to try to punish a set of relationships, right? Um, I'm not quite so convinced by this argument, right? So um, I thought the idea was if in order to punish, you need to be morally responsible, right? So if P, then M, right? But it doesn't follow that um, if that we can't punish someone if they aren't morally responsible, right? P then M doesn't entail M then P, right? Um, so I don't know, unless I'm misunderstanding it. There seems to be a problem there with that argument. But to be fair, maybe he's not quite saying that. He's saying something slightly different. He's saying that when people talk about wanting corporations to be punished, they're not talking about punishing relationships, right? What they really want to punish is the people, right? So maybe that's what he means there. Um, but is that really true? Can't we punish a corporation? Can't we punish a set of relationships? So what we would do is we might find the corporation or we might break it up. So this happened, none of you would probably remember. I kind of vaguely remember it when I was very young. There was basically like a single telephone company in the whole country, Bell Telephone, from Alexander Graham Bell. And then in the 80s, there was a antitrust suit, and they decided, yeah, this is a monopoly that needs to be broken up. And you got, Pacific Bell and Bell South and AT&T, all were sort of splinters of Bell. So, I mean, that's one way you can punish a corporation. Um, so I don't know. I guess I'm not completely convinced by Velasquez that there's doesn't make sense to punish a set of relationships. I don't know. So, I'm interested to hear what you think. So Velasquez really thinks that, those other two options just aren't going to float. And the only really way you could really punish a corporation would be by punishing its members, right? Finding the people, putting the people in jail. Um, so, um, But if that's the case, how does that work, right? Do you punish the members as a whole, right? Like, do you punish everybody at the corporation? Do you punish particular members? Um, what does it mean to punish everybody as a whole, as the corporation, the group that constitutes the corporation? I mean, the only thing that could mean, I guess, is to punish everybody. But that doesn't seem fair, right? If a corporation engaged in fraud and there's a janitor who works nights, right, has nothing to do with any decision making whatsoever, it doesn't seem like the janitor should be punished, right? So the only option left is that, um, again, his reasoning is if corporations are morally responsible beings, then it must make sense to punish them, right? And the only way that makes sense of, he thinks, to punish a corporation is to punish the members, and it must only mean particular members, right? Because there's going to be some members that just aren't to blame, right? So which members is the question? Well, the ones that are morally responsible for the act. So um, he thinks this is a reasonable interpretation of what people really mean when they talk about punishing a corporation, right? They don't know the actual names of the human beings that were responsible. If they did, they would say we need to punish, Jack so and so. But instead, they just use the term Exxon, as a stand-in for the people that were responsible for this thing, right? So, someone at Exxon intentionally brought about actions that caused the spill. Now, nobody at the corporation intended an oil spill, right? It's just a disaster all around. Um, so what we must really be saying is someone intentionally maybe weakened the safety checks to save money, right? Or somebody intentionally got drunk and crashed the boat and so on. Um, Now, this is exactly the sort of gap between individual and corporate responsibility that French wants to point out, right? You have all these different people with all their various intentions, um, and it's the corporation that, did the oil spill, but it's no single person intended to spill the oil. That doesn't seem to bother Velasquez at all, that gap. He says, no, well, all we really care about or all we really want to punish is the person who did the thing that, ended up spilling the oil, right? Who intentionally did the bad thing. So Velasquez finishes up with two additional reasons why we shouldn't consider corporations morally responsible. First of all, for utilitarian reasons. If you only punish corporations but not their members, you're not going to get a deterrent effect. So only humans fear um, reprisals, repercussions, and so on, and avoid immoral activity for that reason, right? So corporations aren't the sorts of things that can say, "Oh, that was bad. I saw that they punished that corporation. I'm going to avoid doing this as a corporation," right? They're not those sorts of things. Um, Again, we might ask whether that's true, right? Couldn't an individual be deterred after watching Pac Bell be broken up, say, okay, I don't want, my company to get too big or they'll break it up and that was bad. So, I mean, I don't know, maybe there can still be a deterrent effect on the individuals if the corporation itself is punished in some sense. And his second sort of, final reason is that if we treat corporations as moral persons, then we might consider the good of the corporation over the good of individuals, right? So, um, if something is a moral agent, then it's not only something that can be punished, but also something that, has a right to a good life or something like that, right? And certainly we don't want humans to suffer so that corporations can, make profits and thrive. Um, and we certainly shouldn't equate corporate profit with human suffering. So I think he's saying, by calling corporations moral agents, um, you're raising them up a little too high, right? You're giving them a little bit too many rights, right? That we don't necessarily want to give to corporations. Those are things that are sacred to humans, right? So, that might be true. I think it boils down to, it's a bit of a slippery slope, which sometimes that's fallacious and sometimes it's a perfectly good argument. He's saying if we treat corporations as moral persons, these bad things will follow. That's an open empirical question whether they would. It's plausible enough, but it would require more research to decide whether that would be true or if there's a good reason to think it would be true. Okay, so well, this has gone on plenty long, I think. So hopefully it's an interesting counterpoint to French, and we'll see another author who thinks that the terms of the debate have been framed poorly from the beginning, right? And we'll talk about that next.